Hey everybody, welcome to the video. So we're going to my favorite value plays for week 8 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. I already have my favorite high-end targets and mid-range plays videos up already if you want to check those out. Then tomorrow on Saturday, we'll be doing my lineup building video and my core plays video as well. So be on the lookout for those. Also, if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. Without further ado, let's dive right into it. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. There's actually two really good cheap quarterbacks this week, and they both draw fantastic matchups, and they're priced within $100 of each other, so you really can't go wrong with both. But Derek Carr, we're going to start with him just because he's a little bit more expensive. He comes in at $5,500, and he gets an excellent matchup versus Cleveland. Now, keep in mind, there's expected to be some issues with the weather in this game, but the total is still at 50.5 points, so I'm not going to be super concerned here, but just know there might be some weather that could impact this game. But I do like Derek Carr quite a bit. He's actually having a decent season. He's averaging nearly 300 passing yards per game, over 2 passing touchdowns per game, and he's throwing the ball about 35 times per game with 8.2 yards per attempt. So he's not just being a check down Charlie this season. He's actually taking some deep shots, and I like this game a lot for fantasy purposes. There's a ton of good affordable options in this game. Like for the Raiders, we have Derek Carr, we have Josh Jacobs, we have Darren Waller, and even some of the wide receivers are cheap for Derek Carr. Then on the Browns side of the ball, Baker's pretty cheap, Kareem Hunt's underpriced, then you have Jarvis Landry, RASHARD, HIGGINS, Harrison Bryant. This is a great game to stack for fantasy purposes, and like I said, there's over a 50-point over-under in this game and only a 2.5-point spread, and both these defenses are pretty weak. So I think this is going to be a bit of a shootout here unless the weather gets too crazy, but assuming it's not absolutely insane and they're not playing in a hurricane, Derek Carr should have a pretty solid game here. Browns are 20-50 versus the pass. They're allowing 24.1 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is 26 in the league, over 300 passing yards per game, and nearly 2.5 passing touchdowns per game. So Derek Carr, I know this is a team that likes to run the football, but at $5,500, he's been playing a bit better than that price tag indicates, and this is a fantastic matchup versus the Cleveland Browns and what should be a very good game for fantasy purposes. And then our next quarterback is Jimmy G at $5,400, and he draws a fantastic matchup versus Seattle, one of the worst defenses we have seen versus the pass. I mean, they are just absolutely awful. This should be another good game for fantasy purposes, and there's quite a few good cheap options, especially on the 49ers with Deebo Samuel being out. Then the Seahawks side of the ball, they are expensive, but they're also good plays as well. We got Jimmy G here. We have KENDRICK Bourne. We have Brandon Ayuk. We have George Kittle even. And then on the Seahawks side of the ball, we got Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. Should be a fun game for fantasy purposes. And with 54-point over-under here with only a 3-point spread. So I'm looking forward to this one. It should be a pretty good game. And I think Jimmy G is just a bit too cheap here. And I know his numbers aren't that impressive this season. Not even 1.5 passing touchdowns per game and barely over 200 passing yards per game. But this matchup versus Seattle, it's kind of too hard to pass up, as they're giving up some insane numbers to quarterbacks this season and just through the air in general. But nearly, it sounds crazy, but nearly 400 passing yards per game to the quarterback position. If we want to get specific, 373 yards per game. They're giving up 30.6 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is most in the league, and they're 30th DVA versus the pass. So Jimmy G at $5,400, I know he's not someone we expect to come out there for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, but if he just gets us 250 and 2 at $5,400, we will take that. And just the way quarterbacks have played versus Seattle so far this season, it would not surprise me if he has his best game of the season. So Jimmy G, I think he's a fantastic play here for the price tag, and it's very easy to pair him up if you want to stack with Jimmy G. Like Brandon Ayuk's, I believe, $5,800 off the top of my head. Then KENDRICK Bourne, I want to say, is $3,500. Then you could even throw in a George Kittle as well. I know he's pretty expensive at $7,000, but it's going to be pretty hard to guard George Kittle. So like Jimmy G's price tag a lot, and this matchup is fantastic. Then moving on to the running back position, there's not a lot of value I like at running back last week. I mean, last week was very easy. We had Jamal Williams at around 4K. Then we had GIOVANI Bernard at $4,500. Now this week, GIOVANI Bernard is priced up to $5,800, but Joe Mixon has yet to practice, and actually just got an update about 2 minutes ago that Joe Mixon is not at practice once again, and today is now Friday, so I would think it's safe to assume Joe Mixon is going to miss this game, meaning GIOVANI Bernard, the mustache man, is going to be the clear RB1 in this offense. He played roughly 80% of the snaps last week. He had 13 carries, 5 targets, didn't really do anything on the ground. I believe he had less than 40 rushing yards. He had 37 rushing yards, but he had 5 targets, caught all 5 of them for 59 yards and a receiving touchdown. So GIOVANI Bernard, he should get us around 15 to 20 touches here, and a decent portion of that should be through the air because he's a capable pass-catching running back. And I love this game for fantasy purposes. I mentioned it with my mid-range video because I had a lot of guys from this game, I believe, in that one. But it's a 53-point over-under. There isn't expected to be too much weather there. I know there might be a little bit of an issue, but it's not supposed to be as bad as Cleveland, and I believe there's another game out there as well that's going to be dealing with some weather. And with the hurricane, there's a lot of wind. in a lot of areas this week. But I'm not a weatherman, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But things can change by Sunday, but it is Friday, so we're getting close to it. But still, this is one of the best games to target for fantasy purposes. This is going to be the fastest paced game of the week as well, as both teams play pretty fast. And look, I like Giovanni Bernard at less than 6K being the RB1 on this offense. He's not the clear smash value he was last week, but I mean, he's going to get enough touches to pay off a 5,800 price tag more than likely. And the Titans haven't been that great versus the run this season, more so mid-pack. They're 16th versus the run, allowing 25 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is 18th in the league, and nearly 110 rushing yards per game as well. So Giovanni Bernard, $5,800. I know he's not like 4K like he was last week, but I still think it's a decent price tag for being an RB1 in what should be a pretty high-scoring offense this week. And the second I want to talk about is MYLES GASKIN at $5,200. And I got to be honest, I don't love this play. I don't even love the Giovanni Bernard play, but there's just really no value running backs this week that stand out too much for me. And I feel like this is going to be a week where I spend up at the running back position, the running back position, and then try to find some value at wide receiver or even tight end or even quarterback this week, because I don't love these value running backs. But we know we're going to get volume with GASKIN. He's got a firm hold of the RB1 spot on this team. And really, we should expect anywhere from around 15 to 25 touchdowns for GASKIN each and every single week. He's getting around 5 targets per game as well, which gives him a nice floor because he's going to be involved in the passing game, which is a 15% target share on this team. Now, the matchup versus the Rams, I wouldn't say it's great, but it is easier to run on these guys than it is to pass on them. And it's going to be interesting to see how this offense runs with Tua quarterback. I feel like since it's going to be his first actual start, maybe they just rely on the run a little bit just to make things easier for him. But it's still going to be interesting to see how this offense works. But they're 18th EVA versus the run, allowing the 9th fewest points per game to running back. So I don't love this spot. But again, there's not a lot of value at running back this week. And they actually are giving it up through the air to running backs with 6 catches per game and nearly 50 receiving yards. And we've seen GASKIN be quite involved in the passing game. So I think at $1,500, he's a pretty solid player if you need a value running back. But outside of him, I mean, it just gets kind of ugly this week the lower you go, and I just feel like he's the safest volume play given the price tag for the rest of these guys in his price range. So GASKIN, he's a fine volume play, but I think that's as far as I would go. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position, which is pretty loaded for value this week. There was like 10 guys I think I could have put on this sheet. So if I miss someone you like, it's not because I don't like them. It's just because I don't want to be here for an hour listing value wide receivers. There's a ton of them this week, so I just picked a couple of my favorites. But AJ Green at $4,500. He's been an air yards monster this season. And like I've mentioned so many times this week, I love this game for fantasy purposes, this Tennessee-Cincinnati game. Both teams played at a fast pace. We got a 53-point over-under, a decently tight spread at 5.5, so I don't expect this game to get too out of hand. But the Bengals, they throw the ball quite a bit. They're throwing the ball around 41 times per game. And Green's been getting a lot of targets recently, 24 targets the past 2 weeks, and he's been serviceable as well. I know this isn't prime AJ Green anymore, but at $4,500 for a guy that's getting double-digit targets the past 2 weeks, I will take that. On the season, around 8 targets per game, a 20% target share. He's actually 5th in the league in air yards with a 30% market share of the team's air yards here and an 8 out of 12.2. But this is a good matchup as a wide receiver versus Tennessee. They have struggled versus that position this season, allowing nearly 50 DraftKings points per game. If you want to get specific, 47.7, which is the 4th most in the league. Nearly 200 receiving yards per game and 1.5 receiving touchdowns per game to wide receivers. So love AJ Green here. I actually like all the Bengals wide receivers. We have Tyler Boyd, we have T. Higgins, and we have AJ Green, but I like this price point on AJ Green a lot. And he's definitely one of my favorite value plays on this slate. And if you're playing Joe Burrow, it would definitely make sense to pair him up with AJ Green, or at least one of his pass catchers. But I do like this price a lot on AJ here. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is RASHARD Higgins at $4,200. Now, if you guys don't know anything about RASHARD Higgins, he's actually developed a nice chemistry or a nice connection with Baker Mayfield over the years, and it's actually one of the big reasons that he re-signed with Cleveland is to stay with Baker Mayfield. And he's going to be stepping in the Odell Beckham Jr. role for the most part. He played nearly 80% of the snaps last week, and he caught all 6 of his targets for 110 yards. And like you can see in the picture, he made a big catch late in the game to help get the Browns the win. And the guy's actually pretty good. Now, he always gets overshadowed because you have Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. on the team, but the guy's actually not that bad. And like I mentioned earlier, he does have a good connection with Baker Mayfield. And this is a pretty good matchup here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. They are 29th DVA versus the pass this season, allowing 40.4 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is 22nd in the league, nearly 200 receiving yards per game, and a little bit over receiving touchdown per game as well. I think this game is going to be pretty much a shootout. There's going to be a lot of points scored, according to Vegas, and I would agree too. 2 pretty poor defenses, and the Browns, they've been putting up a lot of points this season. Their offense has looked pretty good, and like I mentioned with no Odell Beckham Jr., Higgins should see a pretty prominent role in this offense, and he did play around 80% of the snaps last week. So Higgins at $4,200, I think he's a very nice value play this week. And the last wide receiver I want to talk about is Kendrick Bourne at $3,500. He is almost free this week, and with Deebo Samuel going to be out for this game, that's just going to be an uptick in usage for Kendrick Bourne. I know he didn't do really anything last week, but don't forget they blew out New England 33-6. And if you're looking at the weeks prior when Deebo Samuel was, limited or just being out, he was actually involved in this offense. 5 targets, 5, 6, 6, 4. Then the last 2 weeks, 3 and 1. But he was actually serviceable in those games when Deebo Samuel was not playing. And at $3,500 going up against the Seattle Seahawks, who have been the worst team in the league versus wide receivers this season, it shouldn't take much for him to pay off this price point. He's a fine pairing with Jimmy Garoppolo, and that's pretty much a free pairing. So it's going to give you a lot of flexibility in your lineup to be able to spend up at other positions. But if you're looking at how Seattle has done specifically versus wide receivers this season, it is ugly. It's almost hard to believe these numbers, but they're giving up 64.3 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is most in the league, obviously. 280 receiving yards per game, nearly 2 receiving touchdowns per game, and their 30th DVA versus the pass. So, love this spot for Kendrick Bourne. I think he should get a handful of targets here, and it's good enough for me at $3,500 in an elite matchup versus Seattle, which should be a pretty good game for DFS with a 54 point over-under and only a 3-point spread this week. And then finally, we move on to the tight end position, and we have Trey Burton at $3,500. This is not a big splash play, but it's just a nice salary relief option. He hasn't seen less than 5 targets in the 3 games that he's played this season. He's pretty much cemented himself as the clear tight end 1 and the preferred tight end for Phillip Rivers in this offense. This game has sneaky shootout potential. I know the Colts defense has been pretty solid this year, but there's a 50-point over-under in this game, and they're expecting Detroit to be able to put up some points. So if this is a back and forth game, I think Trey Burton at $3,500, he should be a decent option. We know Phillip Rivers likes targeting the tight ends. He's done that throughout his entire career. So Burton at $3,500, if he gets this around 5 to 7 targets, he should be able to pay off his price point there. And then last but not least, we have Harrison Bryant at $3,200, who was $2,500 last week, and he absolutely went off. He had over 20 fantasy points. He had 5 targets, 4 catches, 56 yards for 2 touchdowns, and which was a really good matchup versus Cincinnati. But the guy looked pretty good, and I said going into that game, this guy was a good pass-catching tight end in college, and he looked pretty good on the field. I really don't think it's that much of a drop-off from Austin Hooper, so I think we're still getting a very nice price tag here on Harrison Bryant. And like I mentioned quite a few times this week, I really like this game for DFS purposes, and the Las Vegas Raiders do not have that great of a defense. They're kind of mid-pack versus tight ends, but this is the 29th DVOA pass defense. They're allowing 12.4 DraftKings points per game to the position and half a receiving touchdown per game. But he was the preferred tight end in this offense. I know David Njoku had a tight end as well, but Harrison Bryant did outsnap him and out-target him, and the guy actually looks pretty good. And Baker Mayfield does have a decent history of being able to get the ball to tight ends, so Bryant at $3,200, I definitely think he's one of the best values tight ends on this entire slate. And that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure to leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. And if you want to follow me on social media, feel free to do that. If you want to support the content over on Patreon, feel free to do that as well. The links are down below. But if you do want to support my content on Patreon, wait until the beginning of the month so you don't get double charged at the very end of the month, because that's not fun for anybody. But I'm going to get out of here, guys. Hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend. And I'll have those lineup building videos and the core plays video out tomorrow morning and then tomorrow afternoon as well.